So we're talking about whiskey today, and what we're really going to talk about here is kind of the practical information about whiskey. Aren't going into history at all. We're just talking about what whiskey is. Mostly we're looking at American whiskey. I'm going to briefly discuss Japanese and Scotch whiskeys. So this isn't meant to be a historical a look at the history of whiskey or its development or anything like that. That's a subject for another day. This is a practical guide to whiskey. We're going to drill into some subtypes of whiskey that you will probably encounter in bar manuals and that you might want to know about. And we're going to taste an example of each, and we're going to move on. If we're not careful, we could talk for hours about whiskey, and I don't got time for that. So what is whiskey? Whiskey is an alcoholic beverage that is distilled from grains and aged in wood barrels. That extremely broad definition of whiskey, a grain distilled liquor aged in wood, is so broad that basically I can't think of a single bottle currently for sale where that would be the only definition of whiskey that it would fit. And so every bottle on earth, as far as I know, is going to be better described by putting it into one of the many subcategories of whiskey. And so really, that's what we're talking about today. Let's get a baseline about how whiskey is produced, because I think that'll be useful in going forward. Just a couple terms that'll come up that we're going to need to clarify to move forward. So how do you make whiskey? Well, the first thing you do is you grow grains. You harvest those grains. You add those grains to water somehow and allow the water to leach the sugars out of the grains. Then you add yeast to that. The yeast eats the sugars, and the yeast poops out alcohol. The yeast converts the sugars into alcohol by digestion, and that will ferment up to the strength of maybe a strong beer or like a wine. You know, some whiskeys that go through a process they call barley wine. Whatever it is, we call this stuff the wort. We take the wort, we feed that into a still. The still separates the water from the alcohol. We keep the alcohol, do something else with the water, and then the alcohol gets put into barrels for aging, and then what comes out of those barrels and goes into bottles is whiskey. That's it. But you don't need to use one grain. The grains that you harvest are called the mash bill. So you could have a blended mash bill or a single grain mash bill. Most mash bills are blended. You know, maybe it's 51% corn, 15% rye, and then the rest would be barley or something. That's like an example of a particular bourbon mash bill. And we're going to talk about the mash bills of these a lot, because a lot of different whiskeys are defined by their mash bill. Various distillers, various regions, specific bottles will all have their own tweak on each step of that process. They'll have their own mash bill. They'll have their own germination process or non-germinating process. They'll have their own how they handle the wort, what kind of a still they use. There's so many configurations, how they age it, what they age it on, how long they age it, bottling proof. All of these things are going to change the character of the whiskey. The water that you cut the whiskey with has a huge effect too. That's true of all spirits, as a matter of fact. When I say cut, you take what comes out of the still, you age that, and then you add water to it before you put it into the barrel to bring before you put it into the bottle to bring it down to bottle proof. That water has flavor characteristics, wherever it comes from is going to impart something into the whiskey. So, specific subtypes of whiskeys. Let's start in America. Let's start with the granddaddy. Let's talk about bourbon. So what is bourbon? Okay, so bourbon must be made in the United States. That is as specific as the legal definition of bourbon gets on location. There's a common myth that bourbon has to be made in Kentucky. That is not actually true. The law only says that it has to be made in America. And the rest of this I need my notes for. It must have a mash bill of 51% corn. It must come out of the still at no higher proof than 160 proof. Must go into the barrels that it will be aged in at no more than 125 proof, which means it comes out of the still. Some water has to be added to it before we start the aging process. And it must be aged in new charred oak barrels and bottled at least 80 proof. That's it. There's no age requirement. It does have to be aged on new charred oak barrels. What that means is we take oak, make it into barrels, and they burn the inside. How much do they burn it or not burn it? That's specific to the distiller, but it has to be burned, and the whiskey has to touch it. So there is actually like a whole category of bourbons where we would say it has touched wood to meet the legal definition. Like they could pretty much literally pour it through an open-ended barrel and that makes it bourbon. There's not a lot of bourbons that are like that. Sometimes they do that because they're actually aging it on other wood and they want to meet the legal definitions of a bourbon, so it has to touch the new charred oak. And I specify new because a lot of other spirits get aged on disused or repurposed barrels from other spirits to impart some of those flavors. Well, bourbon, it's got to be new, first use, charred oak barrels. So my favorite, well, not my favorite, but a bottle of bourbon I buy again and again is Four Roses Single Barrel. I think it's not cheap bourbon, but I think I never feel ripped off buying it. Let's put it that way. It's not very expensive. I mean, you can spend a lot of money on bourbon. This is, I'm mistaken, it's like $40 a bottle, I think. Maybe it's more than that now, but whatever it is, it's a pretty good buy. Let's have a wee taste of the bourbon. A lot of caramel on the nose. Very caramelly, almost butterscotch. It's like sweet brown sugar, like toasted caramel. Very, very mellow, but I mean a little bit of spiciness to it, but not much. It's pretty much just like, what I get is just like, it's a great example of a good bourbon. It is caramelly and sweet with a hint of spiciness to it, but not much, not like rye. Just very pleasant. This is fine bourbon. I like this stuff quite a bit. Moving on, we're going to talk about wheated bourbons, also called a wheater. Before I get into what a wheated bourbon is, let's talk about what it isn't. There is something called a wheat whiskey. This is a bit confusing. A wheat whiskey is governed by the exact same laws I just described with bourbon, except that the mash bill has to be 51% wheat. It's got to be 1% more than half wheat. There's only like a few craft distillers that I know of making wheat whiskey. A.D. Laws and Bernheim come to mind. That's not actually what people are talking about when they talk about a wheater. So when you make a bourbon, 51%'s got to be corn. And then like the rest of your mash bill is what's called like the flavoring components of the mash bill. Some component will be rye, or maybe none will be rye. But if a lot of it, if a predominant amount of it is wheat, you've made a wheater. Wheaters are a super popular style of whiskey. Two bottles that will come to mind right away that you have heard of will be Maker's Mark and Pappy Van Winkle. For whatever reason, I've never personally been a giant fan of Maker's Mark. It doesn't work for me. I know a lot of people love it. It's a lot of people's brand of choice. Every time I drink it, I do. I go back every once in a while, like at Thanksgiving or something, there's always a bottle. I'm like, well, let's see if I like it yet. Nope, I don't. It's just me. I mean, it's me, because like it's just my palate. Other people must love it. And How to Drink can't quite afford to buy me a bottle of Pappy yet, so we'll have to wait to see how that goes. $2,500 a bottle, it's a bit out of my price range. So that's it. Wheaters are bourbons. They're just bourbons that are kind of flavored and spiced with wheat. Now, I mentioned that I don't like Makers and that I can't afford Pappy, but another one is Larceny, which is produced out of Heaven Hill, I'm pretty sure, right? Yeah, this is actually Old Fitzgerald. I think that's still Heaven Hill. Whatever, we're gonna not to be specified. So one that came up when I was looking for another wheater to try was Larceny. I've never tried it before, and I figured, well, I don't like the other big one, so if I'm gonna spend money on a wheater, I should buy one that I might like. Let's try this Larceny bourbon. I hear good things about it. 92 proof. Should we read the labels? John Fitzgerald's weakness was fine bourbon, and he faced temptation every day. Jesus Christ. As a treasury agent, oh boy, with the only set of keys to the rick houses, taking from barrels was easy, but he didn't just take from any barrels, he took from the best barrels. Some say he was a thief, others claim he was a man of great taste. This is the legend of Larceny. I'm honest, I get a lot of acetone on the nose. Lots of acetone on the nose. That's not great sounding. What does that taste like, man? Why am I having a hard time with that? Peanuts. I get like boiled peanuts, and bread. Actually, like crusty bread, crusty bread, like a dried out baguette, and just like the hint of that sweet corn bourbon thing. So the wheat is dominant, but you definitely get some of that kind of caramel stuff. Corny label aside, I think this is a great wheater. This brings me to rye. Rye is a dominant and important part of the American whiskey market. And rye whiskey does follow basically the same as wheat whiskey rules, not wheater whiskey, not wheater bourbons, but a rye, if it's labeled rye and sold in America, it means it's 51% rye grain on the mash bill. Otherwise, it's the exact same rules as bourbon. 51% rye, and the rest is bourbon. That's not to say that a lot of bottles of rye will not significantly exceed that rye mash bill. Yeah, there's a famous mash bill of MGP that is 95% rye. You'll find that in a lot of different bottles. We'll come back to that and non-distilling producers in a bit. If I go for a bottle of rye and I'm not trying to spend an arm and a leg, Rittenhouse is the way to go. Rittenhouse Bottle and Bond straight rye whiskey is an excellent rye. Let's get into it. Typically, rye is going to be spicier and rye-ier than your standard bourbon whiskeys. Okay, here we go. Swirl it around. Let me get in there. Okay, here we go. Right away. Yeah, you get like spicy rye spiciness. It's funny to me, it calls to mind sort of cherry pits, which is weird. I don't know why, but there is like that rye spice for me is kind of reminiscent of certain kinds of fruit, because I mean, it's rye spice, but it's not spice in like the traditional sense. It's spice in the sense of a distilled spirit that is devoid of all sugar. So it's a little different than what you would expect to say something is spicy, unless you're going into your spice cabinet and just eating the spices. You're probably not doing that. Usually when you say something is spicy, you're thinking of like, banana bread or something, or I don't know, whatever. You might mean like hot, spicy, like Mexican food or something like that. That's not really what we mean. We mean more like baking spices. But it's weird to try to objectively perceive baking spices devoid from sugar, since baking usually involves sugars. Even baking bread, there's the sugar that's kind of inherent in the wheat and stuff like that. Yeah, so I do actually get a quick, oh, that's like slightly sweet. And that quickly gives way to that rye bread baking spice, which is why I think maybe I get some sort of stone fruit from it, some cherry. I get cherry, I don't know. I get a little bit of, I like cherries. Very nice. Excellent. Not a tremendously long evolution, but a perfect example, I think, of a rye. And one that certainly will not cost you an arm and a leg. Although the price has gone up. This stuff used to be super cheap. It was like $10 a bottle, like 20 years ago. I think you can get it for like 24 or something like that. So still pretty good buy. So let's talk about corn whiskey. What is corn whiskey? So to be corn whiskey, it's got to be 80% corn and distilled to not more than 160 proof, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the same as bourbon. Does not need to be aged, but if it's going to be aged, you got to age it in oak barrels at not more than 125 proof. If those oak barrels happen to be new oak barrels that have been charred, whoops, you just made bourbon. So it's very easy for corn whiskey to accidentally become bourbon. To make bourbon, you just got to be 51% corn or more. So if you have 80% and you put it on new charred oak barrels, it's bourbon. If you put it, if you don't age it or age it on anything else, you know, second use barrels, it's corn whiskey. What corn whiskey do I buy? My beautiful mellow corn. Now this is a serious bargain buy. If I'm not mistaken, this is 12 bucks a bottle. And it's perfect. It's bottled in bond, corn whiskey. Almost no nose to speak of whatsoever. I mean, it's very faint hints of alcohol acetone. But I mean, it's pretty mellow. Mellow corn. Just sweet. And it really tastes like corn. I mean, I can taste the corn. I mean, there's something to be said for the fact that you have to practice your palate. You know, when I was 22 years old, if I drank a straight whiskey, all I would taste would be fire and burning. And you develop that over time. I can definitely just taste like corn, like an ear of corn in there. Sweet Jersey corn. And like fresh cut grass too, which is a cousin to that corn taste when I think about it now. I never thought about that before, but the taste of fresh ear of corn and cut grass, they're right next to each other. I mean, this tastes like corn. It's delicious. Love it. Awesome. So those are my 4 American whiskeys that I wanted to sample. There's a couple of other terms that I haven't really covered, but that I've touched upon just verbally. We've said the words, and we should talk about them right now before we move on. So the first one is straight. Now, what does it mean when a whiskey is labeled as straight? This is called straight rye. This isn't. This is Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. This is straight corn whiskey. So to be labeled as straight in American legal liquor parlance, of course it needs to meet all the other legal requirements of a bourbon or a corn whiskey or a rye, but it also has to be aged for at least 2 years. And if it's aged less than 4 years, it's going to have to carry an age statement to that effect, okay? And it can be modified in no way other than by blending various barrels of the same booze. So if you had like a couple different years of, for example, well, this is actually single barrel, but hypothetically, if you had a couple different barrels of the same, from different parts of the rick house, because they age differently, you could blend them and make it straight. You can add water to it, of course, to drop its proof down for bottling, and you can chill filter it. That's it. You can't add anything else to it. You can't use any fining agents. You can't add any sugars. You can't add any flavorings or colorings, nothing. You can't do anything to it if it's labeled straight. The other one that you'll see a lot of is bottled in bond, and actually a couple of these are bottled in bond. Both of these guys are bottled in bond. This one is not, this one is not. Okay, so to be bottled in bond, it has to be the distillation product of a single distillation season produced by one distiller at one distillery. It has to be aged for a minimum of 4 years in a federally bonded warehouse, and it has to be bottled at 100 proof. And the label has to identify the distillery and where it was distilled, and if it's any different, where it was bottled. So for example, distilled and bottled by Heaven Hill Distilleries, Incorporated, Louisville, Kentucky, bar address, like specific actual address where you can just drive there. Bottled in bond under U.S. government supervision, 50% alcohol, distilled and bottled by Heaven Hill Distilleries. Heaven Hill must have a federally bonded warehouse. And then the other one is Tennessee whiskey. I don't have anything here. That's actually really weirdly specific. That is specific to the state of Tennessee. So Tennessee whiskey is a straight whiskey that is produced in the state of Tennessee, and although almost all of the Tennessee whiskeys would meet the legal definitions of being a bourbon, for one reason or another, they prefer to label their bottles as Tennessee whiskey. There is one other thing that is unique to Tennessee whiskeys, which is that they have to go through the Lincoln County process. That is essentially charcoal filtering. It's a process by which the product is steeped on chips of charcoal. Only one bottler of Tennessee whiskey is exempt to that, and it's due to a grandfathering clause in the law, and that is Benjamin Pritchard's. Benjamin Pritchard's, for whatever reason, doesn't have to do the Lincoln County process. They still get to be called Tennessee whiskey. That's it for American whiskey. We're gonna move on just a little bit. So let's talk about Canadian whiskey. Well, what is Canadian whiskey? Canadian whiskey, and again, I wanna reference the law, so I'm gonna pull up the paper, and I don't got a teleprompter, so I gotta do it here. And I don't know if you know this or not, but when I put titles up on the screen, I can't read those. I can't read those. Those are just for you. So if I could read them, that'd be great. So Canadian whiskey must be mashed, distilled, and aged in Canada. Be aged in small wood for not less than 3 years. These are quotes. Now, small wood, I think, is legally defined. I think that means barrels that are not bigger than 400 liters or 700 liters. They're pretty small by barrel standards. And the size of the barrel matters. A smaller barrel will age something faster. If you have like one of those like little 3 liter barrels for aging cocktails in or whatever, like a week in that is like a very long time compared to like a big barrel. It has to do with surface area to volume. Contain not less than 40% alcohol, 80 proof, and may contain caramel coloring and flavoring. Within these parameters, Canadian whiskeys can vary a lot, blah, blah, blah. The flavoring can really be a big deal. There is an additional requirement for Canadian whiskey that is written into the law that is open to a huge amount of interpretation. It must possess the aroma, taste, and character generally attributed to Canadian whiskey. Okay, so there's a big room there for interpretation. I think that's fine. I think that as long as we've got people magistering that law that understand what Canadian whiskey is, we're okay. In America, for a very long time, Canadian whiskey was more or less synonymous with rye. Canadian whiskey generally has a higher rye content. Now, that's not to say that it would all meet the requirements to be sold as rye in America. 18% rye is considered to be like high rye content for most whiskeys. So that's well short of 51%. Nonetheless, in America for a very long time, rye was in very short supply in our bottles. And by reaching across the northern border, you would find a rye-er whiskey. There's a lot of myths that grow out of Prohibition, that like Prohibition was the invention of cocktails. No, that's not true. One thing that is true is that an American taste for Canadian whiskey developed during Prohibition because that was the whiskey you could get. They were still making it up there and you could get it right across the Great Lakes. We would have our whiskey over here, right in Chicagoland, The Canadian whiskey to buy is Canadian Club. Comes in a purple bag. That is great if you play Dungeons & Dragons because you get a huge dice bag thrown in for free to keep all your dice in. The number of times I've seen people dump out their Canadian Club bag of dice on the table. Oh my God. But Canadian Club came out with a 100% rye version and I just couldn't help myself. True. This is now 100% rye. I think Canadian Club is pretty darn high rye. I think it would even I think their mash bill would meet the legal definition of an American rye anyway. But I like this. I even like the shape of the bottle. It makes me feel like an old detective or something, like solving mysteries. I like Dashiell Hammett. I read a lot of that. You ever read Red Harvest? Hell of a book. It's got a real vintage look, that green and gold. All right, here we go. Canadian Club. Pleasant Nose. What is that? You know I'm a mess because I'm getting marshmallows on that. Toasted marshmallows? I don't know. Okay. Something. Cool to the lips. Wow. Caramel. Mostly like a caramel, but there is something else in there. There is a nuttiness to it that I think is their rye. I think that's what that is. A little bit of nuttiness to it. Yeah. Almost almondy, that rye here. I love it. It's a great whiskey. It's definitely on the sweeter end for 100% rye. I'm interested by that. Or at least that's what I'm getting now, having drunk a few whiskeys today. So it's possible I've already abused my palate and these tasting notes are of no use to anybody. One other thing, why did Canadian whiskey favor rye? Well, rye apparently grows pretty good in colder climates. That's kind of it. Moving on to Scotch. There is too much to talk about with Scotch. We are going to very, very briefly discuss Scotch. I don't want to, this is an entire episode here. We kind of did it with the highball, but there's a lot to talk about with Scotch. Just very quickly, the laws regarding Scotch. All Scotch whiskey must be aged in oak barrels for at least 3 years. I didn't say new, I didn't say charred. Any age statement on a bottle of Scotch whiskey expressed in numerical form must reflect the age of the youngest whiskey used to produce the product. As of 2009, new laws will define and regulate the production, labeling, packaging, as well as advertising of Scotch whiskey. Scotch whiskey is defined as produced at a distillery in Scotland from water and malted barley, to which only whole grains of other cereals may be added, all of which have been processed at that distillery into a mash, converted at that distillery into a fermentable substrate by endogenous enzyme systems, fermented at that distillery only by adding yeast, distilled at an alcoholic strength of volume of less than 190 proof, oh hey, wholly matured in an excise warehouse in Scotland in oak casks of capacity not exceeding 700 liters, that's 185 gallons here in the US, for at least 3 years, retaining the color, aroma, and taste of the raw materials used in and the method of its production and maturation, and containing no added substances other than water and plain E150A caramel coloring, comprising a minimum alcoholic strength by volume of 40% in the bottle. That's 80 proof. Okay, so that's what you need to know about Scotch. Beyond that, I would say that, and I might get these terms, there's basically 5 styles of Scotch that cover the permutations of being multiple grain or singular grain and multiple distillery or singular distillery, okay? The Whiskey Tribe did a great demo on this. So single, that's what it is. Single denotes not individual grain or individual malt. It means individual distillery. Whereas the second word, malt or grain, denotes whether or not this is malted barley or a blend of grains. So single malt, 1 distillery, malted barley. Single grain, 1 distillery, multiple grains. Blended whiskeys, which is what is the other style that you tend to run into, is going to involve multiple distilleries, okay? And most of the scotches that you encounter are blends, red label, black label, Treacher's, Johnny Walker. They're blends. And the idea is traditionally to put together a bunch of different stuff and come up with a consistent product. Right here, we've got blended malt Scotch whiskey, rooted in malt whiskey tradition. So I think that means it's going to be 100% barley, but blended from multiple distilleries. And Monkey Shoulder, if I'm looking for a mixing whiskey, a blended whiskey, I like Monkey Shoulder. You can get this for less than $40 a bottle, which is a pretty decent bargain. It runs about the same price, I think, as Black Label. Red Label will be cheaper. I think Red Label gets a bad rap, actually. I don't hate Red Label at all. People who hate Red Label, I don't know, I think it's fine. It's Red Label though, right? So it's a different thing. So we'll have a little taste here of the delicious Monkey Shoulder. Ahoy dram! As I offend the entire nation of Scotland. My grandmother was very into our Scottish heritage, actually. She once famously got off of a plane that she had boarded when she found out the pilot had an accent, and she inquired as to what clan he was from. She found out he was a Campbell, and she got off. That was it. She had nothing to do with that plane. McDonald's did not like Campbells. It's an old feud. So I've talked about this before. I get banana funk on this, but it's almost rum-like in its nose to me. I get bananas and then bread, so banana bread actually. It actually smells a lot like baking banana bread. It's just light and malty, banana, fruity, and then it finishes sweet. I love it. That's a great whiskey. You definitely get a lot of cereal, like toasty kind of cereal notes there. Delicious. Excellent. Really good whiskey. Today, that one's really kind of working for me, every day. Like, that one's really connecting for me right now. And then that brings me to my final chapter on whiskey, which is Japanese whiskey. Japanese whiskey, again, is of course a whole nother world of whiskey. We could do an entire episode or series of episodes on Japanese whiskey. There are so many distilleries and bottlings. Back to, just to finish up on Scotch. In addition to these blends versus single malts are going to be defined by their region. 5 regions of Scotch whiskies: Speyside, Campbelltown, Islay, Highland, and Lowland, and I'm sure there are subdivisions therein. They all have their own characteristics. Islay whiskies, of course, are famous for being peated. The peat there is used in the process of arresting the germination of the grains. Anyway, that is for another episode. All right, moving on. We're going to talk about Japanese whiskey. Although Japanese whiskey production starts in 1870, the first Japanese commercial distillery opens in 1924. It is the Yamazaki. So Japanese whiskey is, broadly speaking, an attempt to emulate the Scotch style of whiskey. There's a lot of different types of whiskeys in Japan. We could definitely do an entire episode on it. We could do a whole thing on the Japanese highball, which is like a real specific, like it's a tradition, it's a thing in Japanese bartending. There's definitely more to do there, and it's not the subject of this episode. All you need to know is that, broadly speaking, Japanese whiskeys are very similar to Scotch whiskeys. I'm sure there are laws governing it, and unfortunately, at this time, I don't have them at my fingertips. Perhaps Edit Greg will put them on the screen while we listen to some elevator music. As I mentioned before, I can't read them, so this is pantomime. Oh, aren't they great? I actually don't really have a personal preferred Japanese whiskey, but while I was looking for Japanese whiskey, this Akashi White Oak kind of caught my eye. I figured we should try this one out. It looks cool. It's 80 proof, Aigashima whiskey, Akashi, product of Japan, white oak. So presumably aged on white oak. Oh, what is that nose? That's different. This is literally the first sip I've had of this. Something like kind of astringent in the nose, but not acetate. That's kind of interesting. I think I'm smelling the tannins from the wood, if I had to be honest. It's like a little bit of a bitter kind of odor, biting, kind of, maybe adjacent to vinegar, which sounds like a negative, but like vinegar, but not vinegar. Those unusual characteristics. That is, it kind of reminds me of Chivas Regal, actually. It tastes almost, I mean, it tastes a lot like Chivas to me. That's crazy. Which, I drank a lot of Chivas when I was younger, for whatever reason. So to me now, I how do I break that down? But I just know it tastes like Chivas. A little bit of smoke, not like an Isla smoke, but just a light hint of smoke. Yeah, a little bit like a smoky thing going on. Light smoke and sweetness all the way through. That's nice. It's very nice. It's a very approachable whiskey. This Monkey Shoulder has like no smoke in it as far as a Scotch goes. It's completely the other end of that spectrum. Yeah, like a woody kind of sweetness with smoke. It's very nice. It's very nice. The only other thing I wanted to talk about real quickly was non-distilling producers, which really is only a thing here in America. Certainly in Scotland, there are bottles that contain whiskeys that were not produced by the bottler, but they're pretty upfront about that. They might not reveal all of their secret formulas about who they're blending, but they'll be upfront about the fact that it's a blend. It's not, it's not produced by us. There's this thing that goes on in America where people are kind of shy about that, and a lot of different companies are. It takes a long time to make whiskey. You have to make it and age it before you can sell a product that is something people want to buy, and it takes a long time to kind of get that just right. So maybe some of those years of aging are wasted. It could take 8-10 years before you can go to product. Go to market. That's a long time. So a lot of companies, particularly when they are young, they buy barrels of proven whiskey from somebody else and put it into their own bottles. This is called non-distilling producing. It is a practice that some people are really offended by. There's nothing really wrong with it. The issue is when companies claim, to be producing their own whiskey when in fact they're buying it from somebody else. Probably the biggest supplier of whiskeys in the non-distilling producer world is a company called MGP in Indiana. And actually, it's like a distillery. It's been around since the 1800s, if I'm not mistaken. It was originally the Seagram's Distillery, or for a number of years, it was the Seagram's Distillery. So it's not like it's some upstart or whatever. They've really figured this thing out. They make great whiskey. And you'll find MGP products in a lot of bottles. None of those bottles will make reference to the fact that it is from MGP, but if you see distilled in Indiana, you know it's MGP. It'll be like distilled in Indiana, bottled in Kentucky. Distilled in Indiana, bottled in wherever. That is a clear indicator that it's MGP. Nothing wrong with that. The question is, when they get that stuff, do they age it more? Do they have a personal in-house process to make it different from what's in MGP? Because if the answer is no, then you would be best served by buying the cheapest available bottling of that same MGP mash bill in your area. Or when they get that product, do they lie about making it themselves? I mean, I'm just gonna call them right out. Templeton Rye is full of shit. I think it's Templeton. Yeah, they have like a whole story about like finding, oh, my great-grandpappy's recipe that he got off of Al Capone. I found it in his old suit jacket at his funeral, and I kept it with me in my wallet, and then I made the whiskey. Bullshit. You went down to MGP, and you picked out a barrel from, you know, Rick House number fucking H and row 47, and you bought a couple of those or whatever, and then you put them in bottles, and you called it your own stuff. Nothing wrong with doing that, just let's be honest about it. I understand that most of these companies have to sign non-disclosure agreements with MGP. MGP, I think, wants to be kind of behind the scenes. They don't want anybody to know they exist. To a certain extent, Cat's mostly out of the bag. You know, a lot of people have been talking about this for a long time. I'm not like, you know, breaking any news here. So I think I'm seeing some talk about MGP being a little bit looser than it used to be. But yeah, anyway, my point is that just be aware. A lot of times you're paying for marketing, which kind of annoys me. I like Heaven Hill because there's a few distilleries that really make their own stuff. Heaven Hill is one of them. I like Heaven Hill. And Heaven Hill will provide for other bottlers as well. I like Jim Beam. I like Suntory. Of course, Beam Suntory is one company now. Brown. And I like MGP. I don't want to pay for marketing. Let's just put it that way. All right, well, that's the show, How to Drink. The show about making cocktails and how to drink them today. I didn't make any cocktails. We just talked about whiskey. I hope that you like this kind of content. If you want to see more of it, well, let me know. I am on Twitter at How to Drink. I'm on Instagram at How to Drink, and I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/howtodrink. If you love this show, I hope you will subscribe and please turn on notifications. Join the Ding Dong Gang. That's the bell gang. Ring a ding dang dong. Get on there. But I do come out with videos on Tuesdays and Fridays unless something goes wrong. I think I drank enough whiskey. If I drink any more whiskey for fun, we're going to be in trouble. That was the show.